Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it truly means to be the church in today's culture. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's just the two of us today. This is the first two-person episode we've done since we started doing video.
Yeah.
I mean, for years, literally years, this podcast was two people. It was me and Andrew.
Yep.
And man, the good old days, I guess, is what we call them there.
Well, that hurts, but
that's fair. Yeah. I don't know. How's life?
Good.
Playing enough golf?
Oh, I want to play more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what us pastors do over the summer. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's good to be here. Max and Cody and Brian are with us too. And Brian, why don't you get us started today? We have a question from a listener based on something we talked about a couple months ago.
Yeah, so this listener says, hey, thank you so much for linking the article from Kevin D. Young in episode 300. I feel like it gave me a way to articulate what I am pondering through. Yay, words. So my question for you is, how would the church leaders and or members go about recording ones and fours according to D. Young's graph?
Okay, so why don't you read that again, Brian? We'll edit it. It says reconciling ones and fours.
Reconciling. Recording, reconciling. Okay.
You can just start at that. So my question.
Yeah. Edit point. So my question for you is, how should the church... Oh, I moved my mic. Okay, that'll be a fun cut. I'll start at the beginning.
Okay.
So the question comes in... Okay. Make sure I'm on. So the question comes in. Thank you so much for linking the article from Kevin D. Young in episode 300. I feel like it gave me a way to articulate what I am pondering through. Yay, words. So my question for you is, how should the church leaders and or members go about reconciling ones and fours according to D. Young's graph?
All right. So this is episode 300. This is the episode where we talked about, is it loving to wear a mask or not? And we utilized an article from Kevin D. Young on Gospel Coalition called Why Reformed Evangelicalism Has Splintered, 4 Approaches to Race, Politics, and Gender. And so before we answer this question, let's rehash this a little bit so we know what we're talking about. So Kevin D. Young has this article where he talks about how he feels like Reformed Christianity has splintered over the last handful of years. And he talks about 4 different ways of looking at issues. And he makes it pretty clear here that that when we have these differences, it's not that somebody is one way all the time. You know, it could be they could be a number 2 on one issue, a number 4 on another issue. But the number 1 here is contrite. They look at the church's complicity in past and present evils. We've been blind to injustice, prejudice, racism, sexism, and abuse. And then what the world needs to see is a church owning its sins and working. And so the contrite person, if I go down to the graph here, for instance, on wearing masks, the contrite person would say, I feel unsafe and uncared for when masks aren't worn as it relates to systemic racism. Contrite person says that it's rampant, disparities imply discrimination. Second person is compassionate. They look at the many people hurting and grieving in our midst and in the world. Now is the time to listen and learn, time to weep with those who weep. What the world needs is a church that demonstrates the love of Christ. So on that same issue, on masks, they're the ones who say it's one small but important way to love your neighbor. On racism, they say not the only explanation, systemic racism, but should be seen and called out. Number 3 is the person who's careful. Look at the moral confusion and intellectual carelessness that marks our time. Pay attention to our language and definition. What the world needs is a church that will draw upon the best of its theological tradition and lead the way. So, again, on the mask thing, they're the ones who say probably overblown and a bit frustrating, but let's get through this. On the systemic racism, they say they're open to the category, but racial disparities exist for many reasons. The 4th person is what he calls the courageous person, looking at the church's compromise with the spirit of the age. Now is the time for a trumpet blast, not backing down. What the world needs is a church that will admonish the wayward, warn against danger, and stand as a bulwark for truth no matter how unpopular. So on the mask thing, they're the ones who say it's the sign of government encroaching on our liberties, and for systemic racism, they say it's a Marxist category that we must reject. All right, that was a very basic overview. We'll have a link to that in the show notes so you can go read it for yourself, because it is a great article. I found it extremely helpful, as did this question asker. And I think one thing that's important to note is D. Young intentionally used 4 positive words for those 4 positions: contrite, compassionate, careful, and courageous. And he did that like specifically because these are not like first tier issues, right? These are not like issues of first importance that we would die or divide over. As far as the church goes, the gospel is bigger than all these, and this is, in his view, a way that that Bible-believing Christians can view these different issues. So,
But what's going on there is if people are elevating some of these things, or some people are elevating these things to
sure.
divide for,
Yep.
or
and that's where this question comes in, where the question asker says, how do we reconcile the ones and the fours? How do we reconcile the person on, the idea of wearing masks, where the contrite person says, I feel unsafe when they're not being worn. The courageous person says it's a sign of government encroaching on our liberties, and I'm not going to do it. How do we go about reconciling those?
The question asker is implying that what's probably most correct, or most the best way to approach these things is kind of in the middle with the 2 and 3. And I think I would agree with that. I think as you get to either side of the spectrum, they are a little bit too extreme one way or the other. And so I think some of these issues all of these issues are very different to me. So like when we're talking about masks or we're talking about racism, to me, like the significance of those issues are not the same. So
totally.
What I mean is, like, masks to me should not be a divide for issue. Like, I think we can agree or disagree about masks and about the importance of wearing them or not wearing them, or the political motivations behind them, and those sorts of things. But one way that I've tried at our church to reconcile, I guess, people on different ends of the spectrum is to remind people of that these are not die for or divide for issues. We can agree to disagree on this sort of thing. And what is a die for issue is unity within the church. Ephesians 4, we're called to make every effort to pursue unity in the Spirit and the bond of peace. And so with something that is not a theological, or I would say not a moral issue, I do think, as we said in that episode 300, at least my personal opinion, I think it is a matter of conscience. We need to keep it in its place and not let it become something that divides us, but instead say, my brother or sister in Christ, takes Mass more seriously than I do, or not as seriously as I do, and that's okay. I still love them, because what unifies us is our common faith in Christ, not what we think about Mass. And so I think that's part of it, is helping your people keep the main thing, which is the gospel and those things. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that I would say, and this has been increasingly difficult with the nature of the COVID situation in the season as far as getting people together, but I think one way to reconcile is to get people together, right? Man, I'm trying to remember where I heard this, or a conversation I had recently, where they were talking about when you're isolated, especially like in 2020, 2021, your whole like sphere of influence and your sphere of relationship becomes social media, where things are elevated in volume, in intensity, in discord. And if Twitter is the only way that you are engaging with the world, it can be super easy to get to a 1 or a 4, if you will, or to like look at the other side as more extreme than it actually is. And so I've had many conversations with people who I would consider 1s or 4s, who, whenever we're either emailing about something or texting back and forth, whenever we've been isolated from each other, can feel very combative. That when we actually sit down for lunch or sit down across a room from each other and actually see each other face to face and have real conversations, like the level of combat goes away, and you start seeing an actual person as opposed to an ideology. And so I think that's a big thing, is getting people in the same room. And getting people to look at issues together in community, which again, that's been such a weird part of the last year. It's like, just get people together, and there have been times where that's actually like illegal. So
yeah, for sure. And that's just like a principle I've learned in ministry is like with any sort of sensitive issues or situations that you're encountering, it is best to meet face to face where you can actually talk it through with each other. Email, texting, social media are not the best platforms to have important conversations because so many things can go wrong with the person not being able to see your body language or hear your tone. You're not really able to clarify things on the fly. And so, yeah, getting people together, actually having face-to-face conversations, I think is a huge part of it.
Yeah, all right. So the question that Brian read was a portion of a much longer question that had some more like personal questions in it, like I have family members that feel this way, or I have family members that feel this way. And so we're not going to go into that. We'll respond to that more one-on-one. But like,
I got one more thing I'll
go
say
ahead.
Just about this. And I guess it's more not what do we do as leaders to help reconcile people, but I guess advice I'd give to people who need to reconcile with others is like, it's okay to disagree on things like this. It's not okay to be unkind. Being right without being loving is not right, so like, I think we forget that, especially on things like social media. It's like, you may be right. You may have the facts. You may be saying what's true, but if you're doing it in an unloving way, even if you're right, you're not right in the sense that you're not honoring God, because we're called to be kind and patient and bear with one another in love. And so I think just an important thing to remember, and I think that's a lot more doable face to face. Keyboard courage is a real thing. People get real bold and intense behind the anonymity or the perceived anonymity of a screen and a keyboard. But face to face, you see another person created in the image of God. And I think if you're relying on the Spirit, you can have compassion towards them. So it's not just about being right. It's about how you're communicating those things, I think, is an important thing to remember.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm reminded as I think through this of a time, and I probably talked about it on this podcast before, but there was a graph at one point that showed all the major news networks. And I showed it to somebody. I was like, hey, what do you think of this? And they gave their opinion, was like, I think that's pretty accurate. And they were right-leaning. And so they said, I think it's pretty accurate. However, I think Fox News needs to be a bit more toward the middle. And I was like, that's interesting. And so then I showed it to a friend, and I wasn't planning on doing this. I just showed it to somebody else, and they were more left-leaning, and they said the exact same thing, except I think CNN needs to be a bit more toward the middle. Or maybe it's NBC News, one of those more left-leaning news networks. And so I think there is I don't know if it's a problem, but an issue of everyone thinking that the way that they lean is more toward the middle. And so part of the question here is, and again, this is from more of a personal standpoint, but they say that they have a family member who is a one, like who's like a bona fide one, like definitely, and sees anyone who views, who thinks differently than them as a four, like sees, them on the other extreme. And so how do we counsel people in that to even, see the fact that like not everyone who disagrees with you is, or I would say that not everyone who does things differently than you as it relates to whatever issue it is on the other end of the spectrum. How do we convey that to people who oftentimes, because of Twitter, because of the polarization, because of echo chambers that happen from social media use, how do we, I don't even know the right words, how do we open their eyes to the fact that like just because somebody acts differently than you doesn't put them all the way over there?
Yeah, I think encouraging people not to make assumptions that just because a person thinks one way on a certain issue doesn't mean you need to lump them together with every other, way people think about other issues on that same side. And so these are very different things. When you talk about COVID, when you talk about racism, when you talk about, any other political things. But that's kind of what the news media and just our culture has become, where it's like there's two sides, pick a side, and then part of being on that side is you hate the other side. And so encouraging people that, hey, maybe there's some more complexity here, maybe there's some more nuance, maybe ask the person that, hey, it seems like you're really conservative or liberal with this issue. Like, how do you feel on this other issue? Is it the same or is it different? And like, again, it's nothing like groundbreaking, but like just have a conversation and like don't assume that, oh, they believe this about mass, so of course they believe this about this other issue that's also in that camp or whatever. Like, I don't know. I think we're more, we have the freedom to be a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more selective and be able to think through different issues and not just say everything that's conservative I agree with or everything that's liberal I agree with. Like, there's more nuance and complexity there, I think.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast just the other day, and I'd never listened to the show before, so I don't know if this is something they say often or if it was just this one topic they were talking about. But they said, we're here to complexify the issues that you're trying to make simple in your brain. And it was about like this polarization that's happening, and it was like essentially just trying to like get people to see like, no, this is a very complex issue that you can't just lump people into two buckets. I think that's really helpful. I think that's really good. And I think that when we do that, I'm on this end or I'm toward the middle, but that person's on the end of the spectrum. What we're doing is we're simplifying very complex things, and we're, in a way, dehumanizing and turning actual people and their complexities into an ideology and saying, well, you must believe everything that Ellen DeGeneres believes. I don't know why that name popped in my head, but because of because you think that on this one issue or whatever. So
a lot of assumptions, yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, and so definitely an interesting question. I don't know if we figured it out. I think that's definitely something that is going to need to happen over the coming months as churches are gathering again. I know we've been gathering for quite a while. I saw a pastor friend in New York who just said like he's so excited to begin meeting again here on June 6th. And so it's like, man, like that's it's been a long time. And so a lot of these conversations are becoming because people have been isolated. They haven't been in community together. But
again, just with things that are a conscience issue, because I mean, I've wrestled with this in our church, with things that are more of a conscience issue. Obviously, I'm not talking about like if someone disagrees with like an orthodox theological view or something like that, but like, and we should still show grace in that situation. But like, when it comes to these conscience issues, we need to think Philippians 2, like consider not only your own interest, but the interests of others. We need to show humility and selflessness, and be willing to listen and compromise out of love. Like Christians, the church should be better at this than the world of like, we're unified by our common faith in Christ. We follow Christ with love and patience and graciousness. And yes, the truth matters and is very significant, but we're trying to be like Jesus, who was full of grace and truth. And so how can we balance these things where we don't loosen our convictions, but we also are able to be gracious and patient and forgiving? That's the kind of culture that the gospel should be developing amongst us. So we need to be better at this and keep those things in mind, I think.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Ben, this has been fun. Apparently 2/3 of the amount of hosts means 2/3 the amount of time on the show, which is cool. We'll get out of here a little early today. Cody, Brian, Max, thanks so much for being here. If you'd like to hit us up, ask a question, add your voice to the conversation, podcast@toBeTheChurch.com, or right there in the YouTube comments or on social media @toBeTheChurch. Until next week, we'll see you later.